of violent unrest and looting, the DA visited rural towns and farms across KZN to assess the extent of the damage. In some towns, all shops for basic necessities remain closed. Farmers are dealing with the destroyed crops and the reality of having to flush tens of thousands of liters of perishable produce, like milk, down the drain due to the collapsed distribution chain. This is a crisis that has been looming in South Africa for a very long time, that of food security. Hunger, malnutrition, and poverty grows and is often exacerbated by poor leadership and decision-making. This week, we discuss what social relief is needed for those who are now even worse off than before, as well as for food producers and consumers. But first, we take a look at the weekend headlines.
The recent unrest in South Africa has drawn attention to the country's intelligence structures.
You've got the Minister of State Security telling the country last week that there was intelligence provided to the police officers. And then the Minister of Police essentially saying we didn't have any report on intelligence.
Today is the deadline for public comments on proposed changes to firearm laws. The police ministry has received over 100,000 submissions already.
Transnet is experiencing backlogs after the recent cyber attack. Authorities are investigating the cause of the IT interruption.
As a result, operations have been severely disrupted in ports of Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, as well as Durban's, the busiest in sub-Saharan Africa.
This morning's press conference, which has been called specifically to deal with the issues that have arisen in KwaZulu-Natal as a result of the looting that broke out several weeks ago and the consequences thereof.
Already cash-strapped South Africans will yet again have to dig deeper into their pockets as the fuel price increases effectively from tomorrow.
This week in the headlines, South Africans are paying 91 cents more for fuel than they were yesterday. We wait with bated breath for the president to hold his failing ministers accountable and announce a cabinet cleanup. And the DA launches a campaign to unite, rebuild and protect KZN. But first, public comments on the controversial gun bill are now closed. The DA received more than 100,000 signatures on our petition, showing that citizens are uniting against this bill. We will continue with this fight and urge Police Minister Bheki to scrap this piece of legislation and allow citizens to protect themselves legally. This past week, Transnet's computer system suffered a massive cyber attack. This is the very entity that runs all our major ports. This shutdown has caused chaos across the country. In the peak of citrus export season, entire harvests are rotting as they cannot get into cold storage on ships. And entire supply chains and the jobs that they support are breaking down. We still don't know who's behind the attack. Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan must provide a detailed response on how this will be prevented in the future. Whilst the ANC and the EFF are shamefully race-baiting in KZN, the DA has chosen to focus on uniting, rebuilding and protecting the province. After the devastation after the past few weeks, the DA assisted communities on the ground, met with neighborhood leaders and listened to their concerns about service delivery and safety. And we will continue to do so, because we believe these efforts will strengthen social cohesion, deliver on improved service delivery. The ANC has deserted KZN through racial politicking and poisonous racial scapegoating. We are by no means perfect, but we want to take hands with communities and show that we are stronger when we stand united. Following the unrest in KZN and in Gauteng, the entire security cluster should have been fired. Meanwhile, we have a health minister sitting at home on paid special leave, a deputy president who's on state-sponsored detox in Moscow, and a president who's a mere spectator to it all. As usual, it's all talk and no action from the union buildings. South Africans have a right to know what went wrong and who is responsible for the catastrophic failures of the cabinet. A reshuffle is simply not good enough. We need an entire spring clean. Heads must roll. And finally, the cost of living keeps rising, and South Africans are continuing to bear the brunt of our failed economy as petrol increases by a whopping 91 cents a litre last night. It's going to cost you more to get to work, it's going to cost you more to feed your family, and it's going to make it that much harder to survive. Make no mistake, these are the consequences of an incapable state that has been broken by an inept ANC government. We are the victims of ANC corruption. And the only way we can save South Africa from the brink is to vote for change and to vote for the only party that gets things done. Moving on to the Spotlight feature this week, we discuss what must be done to better support those who are even poorer now than before, as well as the farmers and remaining food stores that are under mounting pressure. Let's take a look at this story in the Spotlight.
The recent unrest in KZN and Gauteng has had a devastating impact on businesses and a number of sectors. The effects are beginning to be felt on the ground.
Food and fuel shortages are now a reality for many people in parts of KwaZulu-Natal and some areas of Gauteng.
We saw footage of crops being set alight, trucks transporting produce, having to dump that produce because of the supply chain disruptions.
Our biggest challenge obviously is for the farmers to get their produce to markets, but if the markets are closed, shops have been ransacked and destroyed, how are people going to access that food?
A dire situation that is being painted by the farmers here.
Many farmers have suffered tremendous losses.
Farmers have appealed to government to provide them with security.
The damage is insurmountable. It's beyond what we can actually quantify right now.
If this is going to spill over to other provinces, then we're going to have major problems.
Hundreds of thousands of people will go hungry, which is just criminal, and it's not acceptable.
Millions continue to live at the mercy of social grants, and while the funds do help put food on the table, the grants do not bring the promise of getting out of poverty.
Sobering, really, just seeing the reality that the community is left to deal with.
Following widespread violence and looting sparked by ANC infighting, tens of thousands of South Africans have been left unemployed with little to no income. This is in a country where 30 million people and over half of our country already live below the poverty line. Farmers are battling threats on multiple fronts, from farm murders to dysfunctional ports delaying exports to stock theft, rioters burning crops, and the drought. And on the other hand, we have millions of South Africans who are going hungry every day, with the situation only getting worse as unemployment skyrockets. In the middle, you have a dysfunctional government married to bad economic policies and anti-business ideology that keeps putting the needs of the ruling party ahead of the needs of South Africans. We desperately need government to implement an increased social relief package to support families and at the same time give farmers support that they've been denied for so long to avoid a total collapse of food security in South Africa. To discuss all of this and more, I'm joined in studio by DA Shadow Minister of Social Development, Bridget Masango, DA Shadow Minister of Agriculture, Annette Steyn, and on Zoom, I'm joined by DA Head of Policy, Ngwenya, and Mervyn Abrams and Julie Smith from the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. Let's jump right into it. Annette, you have recently been in KZN on the ground, assessing the damage after the violent riots, particularly in small towns and in rural communities, which has not been a big focus during this time. What did you find, and what's the situation on the ground?
Yeah, thank you, Siviwe. My first word, it's very difficult to describe exactly what it is that you find. You know, I would compare it to a big disaster. I've never been in a tsunami or another disaster like that, but that is the kind of experience that you find on the ground. It is more than devastation. It's not just devastation. It's a feeling of total disbelief, total shock almost of people everywhere you go. The first thing I want to say is that the whole of KZN, from the north to the south, has been affected, some more than others. But there are total towns and villages that is totally devastated, that doesn't have a single place still standing in those rural towns and villages. That's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is the reason why I went is to exactly go and look at food availability and affordability, which is now the discussion we're having here today. Food security, I always say to people, South Africa's got enough food. So we're not having a shortage of food, but what we do have is the affordability and the availability issue. People now need to travel long distances to try and find food. The other thing is, with the looting and that has happened, is I have the discussion with farmers and the industry. A lot of them are now sitting with products with them on the farms. But because of the stores and the distribution points that were looted, they can't get it to that point. So that is some of the things that we will have to look in and discuss. So that is what we found. There is not a single place in KZN that hasn't been affected.
Quickly, Annette, I mean, so is the issue that more than just the farms having been targeted, it's also because the distribution points have now been damaged, so there's no way to deliver food?
Yeah, it's not, so there's abattoirs that's been affected. I spoke to two farmers that farm with pigs. They couldn't slaughter their pigs because the place where they usually send them was looted. So they're sitting with them. They couldn't feed it because they couldn't get the feed onto the farms. We've seen the milk farmers that had to dump milk on the farms because the trucks couldn't get in and out. I spoke to the sugar industry. 500,000 tons of sugar cane field were burned.
Bridget, I want to bring you in here. I mean, now with the unrest, skyrocketing unemployment, so almost 40% of South Africans are without work. The issue around poverty, the issue around malnutrition has now obviously reaching crisis levels in South Africa. Annette says we don't have a food problem. There is enough food in South Africa, but it's an affordability thing. You're in social development. What is the situation around this?
The situation is dire, Siviwe, in social development, precisely for the reasons that Annette has just outlined. But the situation also is where the unemployment has gone so high that so many people are becoming the beneficiaries of the Department of Social Development. And because of the high unemployment, people are now all running for grants. We know that these grants are not enough for to actually alleviate the poverty levels that we are dealing with in South Africa, where we are told that 55% of South Africans are living in poverty. But of that, which is most concerning, is the fact that 13.2% of 13.2 South Africans are living in food poverty. Now, when you consider that, first of all, the 350 rand is much lower than the lower bound poverty line, which means that they can only just buy food that won't last, but it doesn't do anything to alleviate other social ills that people are facing. And so you are sitting in a situation where so many people are living in poverty, and the most hardest hit are the children in the mix. So that is the situation we are facing. It is no wonder South Africa is talking about 27%, has been talking about 27% of all our children being stunted because of the acute malnutrition that's taking place.
Which, of course, has a ripple effect in many other parts, including, children growing up stunted.
Of course.
Mervyn, I want to bring you in here. You guys do incredible work around research around this kind of work. I mean, there's a number of threats now. There's food security, there's unemployment, the broken economy. I mean, what do you think, what kind of social support relief mechanisms, in your view, are needed, either in the short term or long term or both?
So good morning, Siviwe, and good morning to all your viewers. The situation has been very well described by your two previous speakers. So I cannot agree more with what Bridget had said. It is exactly what we are seeing as well on the ground. So the first thing that we have to look at is that in the aftermath of the social unrest, driven in part, not solely, but in part, by hunger and poverty, we have to provide a level of relief. While we welcome the 350 Rand, I would fully agree with what Bridget said, it is absolutely insufficient for people to basically live off. We have to understand that our unemployment, expanded unemployment situation is such that at about 43%, that even when we talk about 100 or 200,000 jobs being created, it is not going to even make a dent. The other issue is our wage trajectory historically has been extremely low in South Africa. I mean, you look at a national minimum wage dispersed through a family of 4 people, you arrive at lower than the upper bound poverty level. So the immediate ones is to ensure that people can live. And so we have called for the social relief grant to be increased to at least 1,000 Rand. Secondly, that it is administered much more effectively and efficiently. I mean, we would say that all the mothers who collect child support grants, who can now access this grant, should automatically get it without having to re-register. All those who have already been on the database, having received it in the past, should automatically receive it again. We are creating bureaucratic obstacles that we know the department cannot do. So that's the first step. And then in the medium step, we have to start talking seriously around a basic income grant and the value of the basic income grant that can draw us at least out of a level of poverty.
Yeah. No, and Mervyn, I mean, to your point and related to what Bridget has been saying, I mean, we just recently, as of today, actually, have had a 91 cents petrol increase. And a lot of people may not perhaps understand what that means in real terms and what that means for food prices, what that means for transport costs. And I mean, how do you think that this kind of increase is affecting people on the ground?
So it will immediately, I mean, we have to understand that fuel is a major input cost into agriculture and really into the entire value chain of food. Logistics, transport, plastic is made out of fuel, etc., etc. So it would immediately lead to increased food prices. But also, as Bridget has mentioned, people have to travel at a greater distance. And I'm sure Julie will speak to this a little bit later, that how the income works within a household is that they first have to pay for transport, they have to pay for other expenditures, and then they buy food. So there will be less money for food, as well as increased food prices, and that will drive deeper hunger.
Yeah.
So true. And Gwen, I want to bring you in here. What is and in fact, let me bring in Julie straight after you, Mervyn. Tell me, I know that you have been doing the household survey, and a lot of that includes looking and assessing at the issue of the food cost. Julie, what do we know about the cost of food in South Africa at the moment?
So over the past 11 months, the price of the average household food basket has increased by 281 Rand, or 7.3%, and it's now standing at 4,137 Rand. This is a household food basket for a family of 7. But as Mervyn mentioned before, you know, when you look at the increase in food prices, you also have to look at the cost of goods and services across the economy. So, for example, if transport goes up we're predicting between 7 and 20%, taxi fare, and electricity goes up by 14.95%, then those are non-negotiable expenses.
Yeah.
So there are also other non-negotiable expenses. So, for example, parents will prioritize making sure that their kids can go to school, and also that their children are safe. So they will make sure that there's money for scholar transport. Families also will invest in burial insurance so that at least in death there can be some level of dignity. And then, of course, because the food budget is so low to start with, families have to borrow money to buy food. So in order to make sure that that's always available to you, you have to make sure that you service that debt. So really only after all of those non-negotiable expenses have been paid, then only can you start thinking about how do you allocate money to food. And that's really why it's so problematic, because it's not just the cost of food, it's the cost of all other increases in the economy. And then, of course, with affordability, it's also looking at the level of the income that's coming into a house. So again, as Mervyn alluded to, our wages in South Africa are extremely low. Our social grant levels are extremely low. And when you dispense them in a household, you get a poverty wage. So families really, before they even start trying to allocate their money, they know that they don't have enough money to begin with. And then, of course, women now have to absorb the shortfall in wages by being very creative on the ground. But this creativity and this strategy means that women have to now cut back on nutritious food for their families. So they would spend more money on buying the core staple foods like maize meal and flour and rice and sugar and oil. So basically foods that make sure that children don't go hungry, but at the same time families cook their meals. But then all the nutritious food, all the eggs, the meat, the veggies, the fruits, everything with calcium and fiber and protein, all of that gets moved off the plate.
Yeah.
And then there's another aspect to that, is that women love their kids, and they'll do anything possible to make sure that their kids can eat better for as longer as possible. So women are also almost destructing their own bodies. They sacrifice their own bodies to make sure that their kids can eat. So in the future, we're not only looking at a massive child malnutrition crisis, which has long-term effects, but we're also looking at an emerging maternal health crisis. So really, if we look at food, it's the most important political decision we have right now.
Yeah.
We're going to have no type of future if we don't invest in food. And then maybe one more thing, there is an element for us that is really important, and that is a sort of everyday violence that we inflict on women every day. The idea that a mother is not able to support and to feed her child is the worst type of violence you can face. And also on top of that, that women themselves have to take such drastic steps where they don't eat properly themselves to ensure that their kids eat properly. This is a type of violence that people don't talk about, but it's every day, it's pain, it's anger, it's frustration, and it's not necessary. We do have the power to change the situation.
May I quickly come in here? The thing that I did not mention from what I saw on the ground is exactly the health situation. There are doctors, surgeries, clinics, all looted and burned down.
Yeah.
So I was just reminded that so you don't have nutritional food, you have to travel far distances, and there is no health practitioners or health services available to you. So all of that needs to be investigated, and that is what the DA calls for on a social cluster effort to go and see what is happening on the ground.
Yeah. And I mean, Bridget, as Judy says, I mean, we're looking at long-term effects. It's not just, stunting has a long-term effect.
Yes.
Maternal health will have long-term effects.
Yes.
Effects for entire populations of people.
Yes. Which is why there has to be, and one welcomes the immediate SRD grant, but there has got to be a longer term arrangement, a plan that is concrete, that can, where people cannot experience the violence that Julie was talking about, of not knowing where the next meal comes from for your children. This is why the government, South Africa has to prepare or plan for a longer term income security of sorts, so that we can get out of this poverty trap that the country is facing at the moment.
Gwen, I want to bring you in here. I wanted to bring you in straight after Julie, actually, because I think we've had a very good sort of unpacking of what the realities on the ground are. But, I mean, then it begs the question, how did we get here? How did South Africa get here? And why, how did government allow this to happen, where there's this violence that people are talking about, there's this, stunting that's happening amongst children?
Well, I think, it's both a very large and complex, question and answer, but it can, I think, be simplified by the message that essentially we've been very successful, or at least more successful at redistribution, and we are failing at growing the economy and job creation. Now, of course, we want an inclusive economy where the most vulnerable in society are supported. The trouble, however, is that if you have stagnant or declining growth and you're not creating jobs, is that the very revenue that is used to support a redistributive sets of policies, that budget begins to dwindle just as the numbers of beneficiaries are increasing. And obviously that kind of scenario is not sustainable. And if we look at the last 2 decades, that's pretty much what has happened. So if you look at social services, there was a marked increase in access to housing, to water, sanitation, etc. And as well as with social direct cash transfers, in around 96, you had around 3 million of the population accessing grants. That was about 7% of the population then. And now we sit in a scenario where over 18 million South Africans receive grants, and that's about 30% of the population. And in fact, it's been about 30% of the population as grant recipients since about 2010. So the trouble really is not so much with redistribution per se. The trouble is that you cannot support redistributive support and assistance on a dwindling budget, on dwindling revenue. So we must also complement our policy approach with plans for how to grow the economy and get people into jobs. Because if I can just make a final statement, I think in principle, ideally, what we should be aiming to achieve is a scenario in which we provide meaningful support for fewer people. It's difficult to provide meaningful support when the budget and resources have to be spread very thinly across a growing number of beneficiaries. But you can imagine how if we succeed in growing the economy and getting people, and obviously improving educational outcomes, etc., getting people into higher paying, higher wage jobs, etc., the number of beneficiaries will decline, meaning that we can provide more meaningful support that is at or even beyond the food poverty line, as we've been discussing. We can provide meaningful support if we have fewer beneficiaries. And I think it's that failure to position redistribution policies along with a strong growth agenda that has placed us where we are at today.
Yeah, and I mean, and so what then I would ask as a follow-up question, and similarly to how Mervyn had, I suppose, responded to, what in the DA's view from a policy perspective would we do both in the short term and in the long term to ensure that there is some kind of social relief mechanism? And I take the point around growing the economy to provide more meaningful support to a lot fewer people. But how would we rectify the situation? Mm-hmm.
So obviously, like I think all many policy analysts and political parties at the moment, we are evaluating our stance on what a more long-term and perhaps improved social relief system would look like, and hopefully we'll be able to announce that soon. But I mean, for example, on direct cash transfers, it's been our policy position, and we've spoken for a while now about the need to raise the child grant. Some people might be surprised by that stance, but that is for a long time precisely in recognition recognition of the problem of childhood stunting, the fact that 1 in 4 children in South Africa are stunted, and in recognition of the lifelong consequences of stunting, we have always held the position that at the very least the child grant should track the food poverty line, which at the moment it does not. So it would mean it would have to be revised as the poverty line is annually to keep track with inflation of that basket of goods that is adequate for daily nutrition or that daily energy intake. But aside just very quickly from those more kind of direct immediate relief measures, it is important that we emphasize the need to grow the economy and to emphasize that poverty alleviation doesn't belong, it's not an isolated or siloed policy area. Absolutely everything we do in many other areas of the economy, policy areas impacts poverty. So for example, one of our approaches is to also ensure that there can be far more energy independence, which directly affects poorer households, well, all households and business, for example, and we know that we're already doing that. So, for example, in the city of Cape Town with that hydroelectric storage pump system, we have been able to at least guarantee in the city of Cape Town that whilst the rest of the country might be on stage 2 or higher of load shedding, the city of Cape Town is usually 1 stage lower. And sometimes that extra, support provided by that city-owned and city-operated power station means that sometimes even there's no load shedding at all in Cape Town when there's load shedding in other parts of the country. That has a direct impact on all households, including the poorest of the poor. And it's important. I obviously can't run through now all of our economic interventions, but I think a good summary of the importance of your economic policy and standing as well is that it's not just about saying, the city of Cape Town ranks amongst the top, for example, in the ease of doing business in South Africa. But the more important measure is that the Western Cape by far has the lowest number of rate of unemployment compared to the entire country. So the expanded on the expanded definition of unemployment, you have about 28% unemployment in the Western Cape, which is lower than even the official unemployment rate in every single other province. So the important takeaway here is that never mind the nuts and bolts of the policy details, but that policy has a direct impact on livelihoods and on job prospects. And that's very important to bear in mind.
Absolutely. And then I want to bring to the question, and I want to bring you in here, Annette. We've spoken a lot about, and one of the most powerful things you said earlier, that South Africa is not a place that has no food. We do, except that, people can't afford it, they can't access it either through poor growth policies or as, completely unaffordable food. So what would be, sort of, in your view, 3 top things that you would do to fix the sector, to fix the agricultural sector, or at the very least to provide security for the people who are the producers of food in this instance?
Yeah. I think the first thing is that I have to say that I think we have an amazing industry. We've seen it throughout COVID. If someone can think back, it's just last year that we went into that immediate lockdown, and some industries were supposed to be open all the time. The agricultural sector pulled together amazingly and made sure that things worked. I think not many people know that all the implementations on all of us to the number of people that could work at one stage, all of that was in effect for the agricultural sector, but they just put together in one day almost systems to make sure that it works. So we have that. What we don't have is the government support for our industry. In the first place, I don't think government understands the agricultural industry. All the role players from, the whole sector, not only the farmer itself, the understanding of that. So we need to put in place something that looks after our agricultural industry. Not all the time it needs to be something like, a grant or support in that place, but make sure the infrastructure is correct. Farmers are now looking after all the roads around them. They are looking at other infrastructure during this looting time period. They were the people that protected the towns and the shops and, provide security for themselves and everyone else. So it's security, infrastructure, and also, just as I said, support. The last thing I would say is we need to fix land reform. If we cannot get land reform in South Africa right, we might run into another problem of land that's going out of supply at the moment, and we have to bring farmers, small-scale farmers, private industry together in one pool, one room. They want to work together. We've seen this. There's a positive thing out of KZN. We have seen communities standing together. People that never spoke to each other in one small town stood together next to each other, defending themselves and each other. So if we can build on that, we can change the whole outlook for South Africa.
Yeah. Wow. And I mean, Bridget, again, how Mervyn spoke a lot about also the efficiency of distribution of social relief packages or grants. What would be the key things you think, in your view, are needed to fix, besides getting rid of the minister, but what would be your view and some of the things that you would need to do to fix the sector?
I think the sector, more than anything else, suffers a situation where the relationship between the department and the NGOs, who are doing a large part of the work that the government should be doing, that relationship has to stop being top-down. It has to stop being rigid. It has to stop being controlled by the department, because these NGOs are experienced in what they do in the sector. So if the department, as it is happening now, is withholding the subsidies to the sector, that means that the end beneficiary or the end user of the social services is actually put under a lot of strain. And so that would need to happen, that partnership. But over and above that, the department has many strategies and plans that are out there for implementation that have not been implemented. If I can take one, we have a national plan of action on violence against women and children that is sitting there, has not, and the Department of Social Development is a lead department in this. And that strategy has not been implemented. And can you imagine then being an abused and violated woman and child not getting the services whilst the plan and also what happens with the Department of Social Development, at least, is that these plans are so incredibly good, but they are not funded. Yeah. They are not budgeted for. There is no amount of money linked to these plans. So that is, for me, what would need to happen. Over and above making sure that the Department of Social Development's critical positions are vacant at the moment. So there is a lack of capacity. There's a lack of infrastructure. The infrastructure that is being used in terms of even the systems that are used to pay these grants, as it were, are so dysfunctional.
And backward.
Even. And backwards. And we need to also realize that these systems are so exclusive in that if you are in the rural areas, you have no phone, you have a phone that's not smart enough, but it has no airtime. It means that already, before you even start to apply for this grant, which is so needed, you are already excluded. So there are a lot of obstacles that need to be drastically removed for all the deserving South Africans to actually access this relief. Because it's relief, so it means it's needed now. Whilst we work on the long-term issues, we need to. There will be a poverty after March 2022.
And when the grant extension runs out.
So we do need to take care of this. And I cannot express enough how frustrating this thing of government of announcing and then planning. You raise the hopes of people when you announce that there is a grant, that more people will have access to it. And then we are inundated with calls of people saying, where can I apply, what... As we sit, we don't know when the actual grant is going to be in the hands of people that need it so desperately.
And lastly, Mervyn, before we go, I mean, as Bridget says, I mean, this is something. There will be poverty in March 2022, and so some of these things that we've spoken about are urgent and need to be implemented now.
Exactly, and so while we get this relief grant paid out in an efficient, practical way, as we've said before, we have to start thinking, what do we do about the economic issue? What do we do about inequality and poverty? And yes, as Gwen said, there is fiscal constraints. We have been speaking for a long time around the introduction of a universal basic income grant. However, that grant has to be set at a level that will make it a viable economic stimulus. If it's only put at the level of the upper bound poverty line, then it will really only provide food. We also have to look at this grant as a means to stimulate our economy. And that, I think, is the real big debate going forward.
Yeah. And Gwen, lastly, on coming to you, the ultimately, there seems to be one common denominator here, that when we look at birth from a social development point of view, from an agricultural point of view, all these sectors seemingly, whether it's an NGO or the farming community, seemingly they've got the will to want to work together or actually function. But there seems to be at the center of this a dysfunctional state that is unable to create an enabling environment for any of these sectors to actually do what they're meant to do.
I mean, absolutely. And at the core of it, obviously, I mean, it's interesting because we are heading into a local government election. And we obviously, as South Africans, have to provide the right incentive structure for governments to perform. And it doesn't just apply to the current national governing party. It should equally obviously apply to whoever the DA governs, that if a political party does not deliver on its campaign or its policy platform, there has to be electoral change, not just for the health of the country, but it's the most positive thing for that political party as well. Nobody changes when the incentive structure says, well, even if you don't deliver, you're going to be rewarded with that same governance position again. So I think the incentive structure in our politics need to change. And I think when it does, we'll find that actually there's a great deal of willpower.
Absolutely.
Of political.
And I couldn't agree more. And thank you very, very much, everybody, for forming part of this panel discussion. It's been really, really, really instructive. We'll be back after this. Thank you. Cities across the country. The DA governed Midvaal upgrades Sicelo Library to include a new e-learning center. DA governed Stellenbosch installs 1,700 smoke alarms in informal settlements to prevent fire disasters. And DA governed Cape Town to roll out the second phase of an integrated public transport plan to improve public commuting and create 8,000 jobs. The DA truly gets things done. Now, on to this week's DA at Work feature. We speak to the executive mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay, Ngaba Banga, about how he is getting tough on corruption. Mayor, it's so good to have you, and you're looking quite good there with your Madiba shirt. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, man. And yourself, and good afternoon to your viewers.
Good afternoon. Listen, let's jump straight into it. Look, we know that corruption is the enemy of service delivery. And I would really like you to talk to us a little bit about what was the scale of corruption that the DA and its partners found when we first governed NMB, and what have been some of the things that we've done to try and clean out that rot?
Siviwe, I must say, in 2016, the DA manifesto was very clear on what we need to do on corruption. We said we must stop corruption wherever we are. And when we took over the administration, and then Mayor Ethel Trolley and the team of the DA started to act on these things by firstly separating the relationship between the administration and politics. And we had a number of investigations that were conducted. You might have seen on national television this week that there have been a number of arrests that were started by our administration in 2016. More than 7 people were arrested on the contract called Imilongane, and they've appeared in court because there must be consequences for actions of maladministration in any other institution of government. Because if there are not consequences, that the public money get misused by individuals thinking that they own the public office. And I'm so proud that in 2016, in 2020, in November, for the first time, and I think for the first time in South Africa, the DA leadership, even before we took over as an opposition, we made sure that all the councillors who voted for irregular decision, they get to pay for that. Plus minus 2.4 million rand will be paid by the 61 councillors that voted for removing cases in court, and a number of other investigations that the National Treasury have declared because of what we've done to make sure that politicians pay. And for the first time, I'm so proud that politicians are getting to pay for actions in maladministration. Our commitment is to make sure that wherever we govern as a DA, that we have an honest and transparent government, and the government that works on the best interest of our residents, that the taxpayers' money that we receive, as we know that it belongs to the people, that there's accountability about that. What we've done further is that there's been investigation in terms of internal audit of not less than 153 cases. For the first time this week, we made internal audit to table a report for the first time to the residents to say what are the cases that are being investigated. 58 of those have been completed. 16 of those we are waiting for review of the report, both by internal audit and also by security agencies. Therefore, where there's accountability.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's such a crucial point, Ngaba, particularly when you talk about some of the key things that you have done. I mean, you guys have launched a fraud hotline, and that's when you start to separate the administration from the politics, and then reporting back to the citizens of NMB.
Yes, we have a hotline that we've activated to make sure that whistleblowers and any individual, whether it's about a mayor, whether it's about a politician, a member of the mayoral committee, an administrator, a cleaner, who's involved in wrongdoing, that people can call and be able to be protected without coming to mayor, reporting a mayor to the mayor. Therefore, we have put these systems in place to make sure that our people are able to report on this kind of actions of maladministration in the city.
Yeah. And then, Ngaba, I do want to bring this, and I think it's quite important, particularly in the climate that we are in. I mean, you know, you've clearly done incredible work in cleaning up the administration, and well done to you and your team for doing this. And I think it's come to fruition as we're seeing some arrests. But, you know, what would you say to the people of NMB who are living there now to say, we want to be able to govern and do this on a larger scale come 2022 or whenever the election is? What would you say they need to do in order to help you and your team grow from strength to strength?
The first thing is that people must understand that we could have run Nelson Mandela as a majority government in the DA. We lost those elections because of 12,500 people who didn't go out and vote, meaning that the DA could have been a majority government. What that means is that if people want an accountable, responsible, and a responsive government, like a DA of the government, a DA government, they must go out and register. That's the first thing. You go out and register on the election day. You make sure that the people from your family, your friends, and those close to you, your community, go out and vote. Because one of the problems why we get the governments we do not want is that many of South Africans do not take it serious, the fact that they must first go and register. The second one, that they must go out and vote.
Absolutely. And I think it's absolutely high time that we all take personal accountability and vote for the government that we want, a government that can actually do things for us. Thank you so much, Mayor, and thank you for all the work that you and your team are doing. We couldn't be prouder. Let's keep NMB blue and delivering. We'll be back after this. between 18 and 35 and passionate about being part of the change our country so desperately needs, then visit youngleaders.org.za to find out more about the DA Young Leaders program. Applications open today at 5 p.m. for the program, which is an intensive year-long part-time political leadership course known around the world as the gold standard in political development. As an alumni of the program myself, I can attest to what a fantastic springboard it was to my exciting career in public service. Until next time, keep it tight, Mzansi.